The year is 2008. You are 10 years old. You just got your allowance and begged your parents to take you to the mall so you could go to GameStop. Your goal? Find the oh-so-popular Nintendogs game that you've been watching your brother play for the longest time. But things don't quite go according to plan. The game is nowhere in sight, but you do come across something a little more demented. Displayed on one of the shelves, you spot a game with a grainy art style of a bald man. His face upturned as he screams, being engulfed in an eerie blackness. And only for a mere $12 in used condition. You beg for your mother's permission to make the purchase. You've played Resident Evil, so you know what you're in for, but little do you know that the game would become an obsession for most of your middle school and high school years, and still hold a strong hold over you even in your adult life. My friends, strangers and enemies, welcome to my review of the highly underrated Nintendo DS exclusive Dementium: The Ward. Released in October of 2007, Dementium was a survival horror game released exclusively for the Nintendo DS, developed by Renegade Kid and published by Gamecock Media Group. A common misconception about the game is that initially it was pitched to Konami as a Silent Hill game, but was rejected and eventually became its own thing. In the words of Jules Watcham himself, Dementium was born as The Ward, an original game for the DS. However, due to the challenges of finding a publisher, they reached out to Konami to see if they would be interested in turning it into a Silent Hill game. Thankfully, they said no. And even though it wasn't accepted by Konami, they still felt the need to sneak this little ad here from Hardcore Gamer magazine. Now, had I played Silent Hill before this game, this ad would have been a little concerning for me, and a bit of a deterrent, since, with a few exceptions, I have never really liked Silent Hill all that much. Yeah, I know. Okay, you made your point now. You could stop. Hey, Sister Mary Elephant, you want to give me a hand here?
Shut up! Thank you.
The game was popular enough to spawn a sequel, as well as a remastered version for both of them. Sadly, this miniseries never blossomed beyond that, allegedly due to the stubbornness of its creator, Jules Watcham, who wished to make his third release on the Nintendo DS because, quote, it was the most fun console to play on. Not sure how accurate this information is, but I do vaguely remember coming across the quote when I was searching for every scrap of information about this franchise and where it was going. It seems more likely that creative differences, changes in IP, and poor sales are the reason behind its short lifespan. While we never did get a direct sequel to the franchise, we did get a spiritual successor, and I use heavy quotes on the word successor, in the game Outlast, Dementium 3, a bland walking simulator whose popularity I do not understand in the slightest, and whose only connection is the Doctor, who doesn't resemble or act like the one in the former. Seriously, this is about as much a successor to Dementium as the Callisto Protocol is to Dead Space. But let's brush past these comparisons and gripes. This isn't an Outlast review, this is a Dementium review. One of the things that can make or break a game for me is the plot. Very rarely will I play a game with a substandard or lackluster story. And while the plot of Dementium isn't bad, it is kind of a generic and non-existent one. Basically, the premise of the game is you play as a nameless protagonist who wakes up in a dark hospital as a storm rages outside. As you leave your bed to explore, you find a notepad with all but two pages torn out. The first page bears an ominous message, "Why did you do it?" whilst the other remains blank. You also find a small key with a notepad which unlocks your room. When you exit into the hall, you hear a voice on the loudspeaker instructing everyone to evacuate the building, as there is an emergency. It's not too long before you find a discarded newspaper with the headline, "Man Brutally Murders Wife." Shortly after this, you find a blood trail leading from the neighboring room down the hall, where you are greeted with another cutscene of a woman screaming as she is dragged away by a bulky monstrosity carrying a large cleaver. As the two of them disappear through the doors, you head out towards one of the neighboring wings, picking up a flashlight along the way. A siren blares as you gain your first weapon, a nightstick next to the body of a deceased hospital guard, and immediately after you meet your first enemy, the chest maw, a humanoid creature whose mouth has been stapled shut, and eyes pierced with steel wedges, and a chest splayed open to reveal sharp teeth and an exposed heart. I know the Dementium wiki technically classifies these creatures as zombies now, since the release of Dementium 2. Why they do is beyond me. But I refuse to go that generic route with this one. They don't act like zombies, they don't die from their heads being removed, and just look at them. Why do we do this? You have all these undead enemies that stand out differently from any generic zombie, but hey, let's call them a zombie anyway. It's lazy. You see the same stigma in games like The Evil Within and Resident Evil 4 as well. These aren't zombies, people. These creatures have their own unique names. Anyway, you make it through the stairwell and up to the rooftop, where you come across the only other survivor in the game, but he's quickly decapitated by a chest maw who has somehow made it into the room. And this is where you get your first ranged weapon, a handgun. Interesting thing about this room, there are no other entrances, no windows or doors, meaning that this thing either had to be hiding in the shadows biding its time, or maybe it was just laying there posing as a corpse, as we will see periodically throughout the game. As you make your way through the hospital, you will run into this ghost girl on occasion who flees from you. And as you make your way to the next ward, you encounter another enemy called the mollusk, which I had trouble pronouncing before when I initially read the name. But it's a worm-like creature with sharp teeth whose screams resemble that of a crying child. With the exception of the flying swarm and skritters, mosquito and roach-like enemies who will slowly converge on the player in groups, the chest maws and the mollusk are the most common enemies you will encounter in the game. It isn't long before you pick up your next weapon and reach your first boss battle, the cleaver, that grotesque creature who was dragging away that woman at the beginning of the game. He's easy enough to take out with your newly acquired shotgun. Just walk backwards, keep your distance, shoot him, wait for him to try attacking, dodge, shoot him again, and repeat. If by some chance you do end up getting attacked by the creature, he will temporarily walk away from you and cut open a cold locker to release some mollusk into the room, who you will need to contend with in addition to him. After you defeat him and make your way out of the morgue, you exit the hospital and enter a courtyard, where you encounter that woman again. It appears as though she has escaped from the cleaver and is outside of the hospital gates. But this reunion with her is short-lived, as a man clad in a black hospital garb grabs her and drags her away. But not before she drops a key for you to make your way to the other side of the courtyard. This side of the hospital is a copy and paste of the other wing, which is something that a lot of people complain about and call it lazy, saying that the level designs don't have a lot of variety, but it's a hospital. That's kinda how they're designed. There will be slight variations in the design of the structure, but all rooms and hallways are practically clones of one another. Even neighborhoods suffer from this kind of conformity. Go ahead and check it out the next time you go to a neighbor's house. You'll see what I mean. Anyway, you continue to make your way through the dark hallways and encounter more enemies, including 2 more bosses. A geriatric in a wheelchair with a minigun mounted on his arm, strapped with grenades and wearing a gas mask, and a large green room filled with mollusks and living walls with teeth akin to the ones on the chest maws. You encounter the woman and the ghost girl one more time as well before this maw room. The woman is dead. Again. And the girl runs away. Again. You will encounter 2 more cutscenes before coming to the game's conclusion. The first being a TV broadcast playing in one ward, which exposits that a 30-year-old woman was found shot in her home, and an unarmed gunman was injured and taken into custody while the woman's daughter watched the scene unfold before her. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that the broadcast is talking about you, especially with the hints that beat you over the head right at the beginning of the game. Though it appears as though you may have been framed, as the final piece of evidence presented to you is a letter that you will find before the end of the chapter. After contending with the Cleaver and the wheelchair bosses one last time, you finally meet the Doctor, the main antagonist of Dementium, voiced by Jules himself. He briefly taunts you using some telekinetic ability to pull you from the ground, bringing you close to him before pushing you away again. And as you pursue the Doctor, you find a note addressed to a girl named Amanda, telling her to trust her father and that he is in fact not the one responsible for her death. You finally make your way to the hospital's basement, fighting the different enemies you've encountered up until this point before finally contending with the Doctor again. And upon defeating him, well, just watch.
Let the record show that as of 3:33 a.m., the patient has survived phase 1 of the operation. Prepare for phase 2.
Huh. So that's it? Oh, okay. Well, can't wait to see what happens in the sequel. Yeah, the snap ending trope has been going on for years now, and it's become rather exhausting. But this was effective nonetheless. After playing for months and finally achieving this result, give me a break, I was only a child at the time, of course it was going to take me time, especially with a mother who liked to limit your game time, it left me hungry for more Dementium. But, until its sequel came out, I continued to replay the game, hoping that each time I replayed, I would find some additional content which I had missed. And lo and behold, I did! Considering that this is a game that was released on the DS back in the early 2000s, these graphics are pretty impressive. Sure, the style looks grainy and a bit blocky in some areas, and there are some clipping issues in certain areas as well. But with the limitations on the console, these issues are to be expected. Let me also remind you that this was from an era where updates on gaming consoles weren't a thing. Pop in a disc or a cartridge, power on, and start playing. I miss those days. Now, I'm not really sure what else to say about this, honestly. When it comes to games, graphics are the last thing that I pay attention to, seeing as it doesn't impact the game's story. Remember, people, flashy graphics doesn't always equal good game. Now, being a first-person shooter on the DS, this game utilizes the D-pad for movement and the stylus for aiming, which makes for some pretty awkward gameplay, but it isn't so awkward that it renders the game unplayable. And it's certainly better than the alternative, using the buttons to aim, which they did actually do for the remastered version of the DS. But controls aside, the gameplay is your typical first-person survival horror game. Explore, blast, or beat down any incoming enemies and solve puzzles. Though unlike most survival horror games, the inventory feature is lacking. You are sit with a fixed amount of ammo you can carry for each weapon, and you can only replenish health on the spot, as you are not allowed to take any of the health pills with you. The puzzles are pretty straightforward as well. With the touchscreen, you use the notepad to write down any code you find, punch it into the respective door or lock, take items from location to another, and backtrack when necessary. Pretty typical stuff for classic survival horror. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your frame of mind, the puzzles do not change with each playthrough like some other games I could mention. So, if you have a good memory, you could breeze through the game and avoid backtracking, making the story much shorter. What's more, you can also access a weapon earlier than you're supposed to. This does give you a slight edge, though you won't be able to replenish your ammo for the weapon until a much later time. So while the gameplay isn't the worst, it definitely could stand to improve a bit. In Dementium, there aren't very many characters to cover, the only ones who really have any impact beyond the silent protagonist being the Doctor. So let's take a look at these enemies. There isn't much variety when it comes to the enemies in this game. I'm going to skip right past the Skritters and the Flying Swarms since they don't really qualify as enemies, falling more along the lines of obnoxious obstacles, which can't be said for any of the other monsters in this game. The chest maws are all uniform in their design. Shirtless enemies with jeans who shamble around and rush the player if they sense his approach. And their only variation is that later in the game, some of them will spit poison from their heart as a sort of ranged attack, instead of clawing at the player. Mollusks are worm-like enemies that will slither across the ground, walls, and ceiling, picking up speed to attack the player when they sense him. Like the chest maws, they are drawn to sound and movement. And again, this enemy also has a green-colored variant, which has slightly more strength than the brown counterpart. Banshees are screaming and flying heads, which when initially encountering them may remind you of Beetlejuice or a deformed clown. They will wander through the long hallways of the hospital, screaming loudly until they see the player, homing in on his position for an attack with their long, sharp tongues. Last but not least, we have the crawlers, teke-teke-like ghouls who drag their legless bodies across the floor and skitter across the ceiling, spitting poison at the player similar to the second variant of the chest maw. I wish they would have left the mindless wanderers in the game that they initially planned as the enemies. They didn't have to replace all of them with the chest maws. Then there are the bosses, 4 in total, and 6 if you count second scenarios. The 2 repeat offenders that we have to contend with are a grotesque-looking plump monster carrying a large cleaver, which he just so happens to be named after, who also carries a large syringe with poison. Our second offender is a crippled and anorexic geriatric wearing a gas mask who has a minigun fused to his right arm. Out of the 2, the cleaver is the easier one to eliminate. Just keep walking backwards, train your shotgun on its head, shoot, dodge poison attacks, and repeat the process. And the other, aptly named wheelchair enemy, is slightly more of a pain as you have to chase him through a pitch-black room and try to kill him before he has the chance to open fire on you. As his health diminishes, he will begin to throw poison grenades at you, which will slow you down and leave you vulnerable for a follow-up attack. There's another one-off boss battle where you enter this green room with large fleshy walls containing the mouths found in the chest maws, who spit out mollusks to attack you. Again, easy to contend with if you stick to using your buzzsaw and shotgun. The reason that this boss never had a second scenario was due to yet another cut in the game. You will come across another one of these green mollusk rooms, but what was initially supposed to be in this room was a creature known as the Feast Beast, which only showed up in the game's initial teaser trailer, called The Ward. Let's take a look.
Coulda, shoulda, woulda.
Then last but not least, you have the Doctor, arguably the most challenging of the lot. You fight him in a confined boiler room in the hospital's basement, and he will advance upon you, strafe, and use telekinetic abilities to raise you from the ground and toss you around the room. In other reviews I've watched, everybody seems to come to the same erroneous conclusion that this is an unavoidable attack, but in reality, even as the Doctor mocks you, a clean shot to his hand will relinquish you from his grip, freeing you to attack once more. Now, with this being a classic survival game, rather than a certain bland walking simulator I can name once again, of course you're going to get your hands on a variety of weapons in this game. 7 plus 1 flashlight. The first weapon that you come across is a nightstick, a vintage club which officers used to bludgeon criminals in years past. Which makes me wonder where this game is taking place. The game was set in the same year of its release, but I don't think the police were still using clubs like this in 2007. Guess we can write that off as creative licensing then. The second weapon is a 9mm pistol, which I'm having trouble identifying. but it seems to resemble a hybrid of a compact 1911 and a Beretta 92FS. Then we have a pump-action shotgun, which is most likely a Remington 870, as that is a popular shotgun for police officers to use, an electric buzzsaw with an infinite battery supply, a machine gun, most likely an M16, a 357 revolver, probably a Colt Python, and a bolt-action sniper rifle whose inspiration for design I cannot determine. In most games, a variety of weapons like this typically offer different attributes, equipping you for an appropriate weapon to handle each specific threat, but these don't really have any unique characteristics other than the change in their exterior design. Except for the rifle, which is equipped with night vision and a function to zoom in on your enemies. The handgun and the machine gun do the same amount of damage as one another, as do the shotgun and the revolver. Taking a step back to look at the rifle again, while you do have the ability to zoom in while this is equipped, you can only strafe. The controls to move forward and backward are overwritten with said zoom function. Out of the lot, you will mostly rely on the pistol, shotgun, and buzzsaw, as the other weapons aren't nearly as useful and there doesn't seem to be as much ammo for them to go around. Speaking of the ammo, technically, if you don't know what you're doing with this game, it is possible to run out of ammunition. If for some reason you decide to backtrack, which isn't really necessary unless you are looking for the buzzsaw, enemies will respawn and attack you, but what doesn't respawn are the ammo and health items. If you're a novice player, you can very easily screw yourself over. Now, before I bring this review to a conclusion, I would like to talk about the remastered version real quick. Basically, Dementium Remastered is just a copy and paste of the original game with updated graphics and some minor changes to the gameplay. While the story was left untouched, the weapon and inventory system has been revamped to resemble that of Dementium 2. While you're still only allowed to collect a set amount of each ammo, there is now an animation for reloading your weapon once your magazine is spent. Also like Dementium 2, these red mirrors, I think, have been added to parts of the game for you to save manually, rather than letting the system autosave. I suppose this is supposed to be a way to modernize it and make things easier. They do still have autosave feature, but it only seems to kick in after you have defeated a boss. And the way that this change was handled was pretty awful. I'm not sure if I'll be able to make this happen and capture it on my DS, or even on my Switch now. As of the moment that I'm writing this review, they have announced that the game is getting a port on the 12th, but there's a major issue with the autosave function when you come to a particular area. Now, this has only happened to me once when I played in the past, on my second encounter with the wheelchair, but if by chance you are on your last bit of health and he throws a grenade at you before you take him down and it kills you, you are stuck. You cannot restart from an earlier continue point, and you will have to restart the entire game from scratch. Another change that I don't particularly like is that the chest maws can now lock onto your position if you use your flashlight in their vicinity. In any other game this would make sense, but the chest maws are blind. Their eyes are stabbed out with these metal spikes, and they attract their prey by sound. Why are these things able to home in on you just for using a light source? Or maybe we're going for Tombs of the Blind Dead logic, and they can hear our heartbeat.
No hables. Solo así podrás salvarte.
Oh, and they also run much faster than in the original game. But you won't hear me complaining about this change because it actually does make the creatures more frightening. Which is saying a lot because I'm not normally frightened by horror games. Props to the developers for making them just a little bit more terrifying. Another change they made was making the buzzsaw a bit more tolerable. But only by a little. In the original Dementium, this weapon was overpowered, but jeez was it loud and obnoxious. Just listen to this. The second that you switch over to this weapon, it assaults your ears with a high-pitched whistling sound, akin to that of a dentist's drill. In the remake, it hums idle, only to begin making the noise when you use the weapon. I wish that they had changed this effect entirely, and avoided annoying any other players, but sadly this was not to be. And this was completely avoidable too, as the second game fixed this issue. But not with this one. Thanks for reminding me about the second worst part about going to the dentist game. I think that about covers everything. Why more people don't say positive things about this game is beyond me. Even after all these years, I still love this game dearly. The graphics are dated, and the gameplay can be a bit awkward at times to be sure. There's a lackluster variety in the way of enemies, puzzles, and even some of the weapons can be a bit useless as well. And the nearly non-existent story should make me feel off-put. But the developers at Renegade Kid and Gamecock have made a longer-lasting impression on me than anything that Silent Hill has done in all the time that Konami has been around. You could argue that since we don't know much about the protagonist, that would render him as somebody that we don't care about, but in my case, I think the enigmatic way that he was presented encourages you to be more invested. You want to learn about him, and the reason that these events are transpiring. Is he the killer? The note could have been a lie. What happened to his daughter? Is she still among the living? Is she really a ghost? Who's the doctor? What's his end goal? And what connection does he have to William? Can't say I ever had any invested questions like these about an unlikable idiot like James Sunderland. While these games are considered collector's items and can be very expensive these days, you may find it difficult to play yourself without emulating it. But, luckily for us, we are getting a port to Nintendo Switch this October. Unless it's already out, even as I'm editing my script due to this new information. I'm not sure when this review will be posted. But yeah, fairly recently, Jules Watcham himself came forward with a tweet that his new company, Atoy LLC, has reclaimed the rights to make Dementium ports and even sequels. This is fantastic. I cannot recommend this game enough. If you have the means, you should play it and its sequel, and definitely show your support for the creators to make Dementium's resurgence possible. And with that, here endeth the review. Before I go, I would like to thank Jules Watcham on a personal account. Thank you for bringing this wonderfully bizarre game to life. Never stop doing what you're doing, and know that the second that the ports and sequels come out, I will be buying. Fingers crossed for Dementium 3. Hopefully that'll be announced within the next year. Until next time.